Hi, folks. Welcome again to the Petty Podcast. This is Stephen Petty, your host, and this is podcast number 5. I call it the Holy Mask or the Great Gapsy. A little bit of play on words. And what we're going to talk about today is a study that shows that even if the mask had some efficacy, that efficacy is lost if there's any gaps around the mask and at a very low level. So what I want to show you is, and you've seen this in earlier podcasts, but if you wear a mask, you naturally have large gaps below the eyes on either side of the nose, and also on the side. Usually your mask will crinkle up and it'll create some rectangular areas. And I always ask people when they look at these pictures, I say, remember from the earlier podcast that a viron, a COVID particle, is on the order of 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. And do you think you could slip a human hair into those gaps? I think the answer is obvious. Again, the size of a human hair is represented by this blue or this white circle with a black outline. The COVID particle is 1/10 the size of that 1 micron red dot. So you've got COVID particles that are 40,000 times smaller than the cross-sectional area of human hair in terms of area, and about 1,000 times smaller in terms of diameter than the cross-section of human hair. There was some interesting work recently done by Drunick looking at the efficacy of masks, but he was an honest broker. He also looked at, well, what happens if the masks don't seal? Because what you find in almost all these studies where they're trying to prove to you that masks work is that their masks are put on fixtures or mannequins where they're perfectly sealed around the outsides. There's no leakage through between the skin, if you will, or the fixture and the edge of the mask. That's not reality in the real world. And Drunick makes the following comments that I think are right on. He says, surgical masks as well as cloth masks, quote unquote, never have a perfect fit on the face. I think you saw that with the mask that I just showed on my own face. Leaks between the mask material and the skin allow air to pass through without being filtered by the mask material. So you have a freeway, if you will, for the virons to pass. And this is the main reason why studies investigating the efficacies of masks under real-world conditions have significantly lower effectiveness than what you see in mask studies where they're perfectly sealed around the edges by sealing them against a mannequin or some sort of artificial fixture. And I want to show you some of the work from Drunick that really illustrates this in a very graphical way. Again, this is a slide where he did some work where he looked at what happens if the mask isn't perfectly sealed. And the way he did it was a little differently. What he did was he took a perfectly sealed mask and he started opening holes in the mask to simulate gaps at anywhere from 0.5% of the total mask area to 2% of the mask area. That's across the bottom of this plot. And he looked at how does whatever efficacy you have drop with the increasing size of the hole, if you will, in terms of a percent area. And what you see with this red horizontal line that I've drawn across the bottom is that for the solid lines are for 0.03 to 2.5 micron particles. Well, those would be the aerosols. You see that as you get down to 2% hole in the mask, that the efficacy of whatever efficiency it had, say it was 5% or 20% effective, we'll rate that now at 1 or 100%, and we'll see how much does that, whatever effectiveness it has, how does it drop from what it was as you start to put a hole in a mask. And at 2%, whatever efficiency that mask had is reduced by 75%. If you look at the left, that filtration efficacy is down to 0.25. So that means there's a reduction from, look at these as percentages, from 1 to 0.25 is 75% reduction. So this is a very interesting slide, because what it says is that if you have any gaps in a mask at very low levels, as I say here, it kills whatever efficiency the mask had. Now, the question I asked myself was, well, it looks like these curves from 0.5% to 2% look pretty linear, the bottom two curves, what we're talking about, surgical and cotton mask for small size particles. What if we project that out to the right? Where do we get where the mask has zero efficiency? Wouldn't that be interesting to know? So I did that. Same curve, but I just extend those lines, as you see to the right, out and extend the bottom axis. And lo and behold, what do we find? Well, that curve intersects the 0.0% effectiveness of whatever effectiveness it had when you get to 3% open area on a cloth mask. So not only do the masks not have great efficacy to start with, but whatever efficacy they had goes to zero if you have any gaps. Thus, I call it the Great Gapsy, this podcast. So I thought, well, remember that picture we started with me in a mask? I said, let's see what the percent area versus the mask area is for the real world mask. And this is my Spirit Airlines mask, the infamous mask where I was told to wear this instead of a respirator. And you can imagine I wasn't too happy about that. Well, if you look at the areas associated with leaks on either side of the nose, you end up with about 14.6 centimeters, 5-6 centimeters. Appreciate the mask itself is about 165 centimeters. And then you've got some little triangular spaces on either side that result in about 0.9 centimeters. So if you look at all four leak areas, and that's all I'm counting here, they total to about 15.5 centimeters squared. Well, that 15.5 centimeters, as you see along the bottom, divided by the total mask area, is about 9.35%. Now remember before that if you get to 3%, whatever efficiency that mask had before is zero. Well, I'm at 3 times that. So how efficient do you think that mask was? Zero. And remember, I've always talked about, can you get a human hair past these gaps? Of course you can. And the Viron is 1,000 times smaller. So this simply illustrates, based on real research, that these masks can't possibly work because the gaps alone, let alone the lack of efficiency through the mask, but the gaps alone around the outside, because they cannot seal, lead to essentially zero effectiveness. And that's why, remember from my very first presentations, that even though PPE respirators is the least desirable method to protect people under the hierarchy of controls, recall I always said, well, masks don't even fit within the hierarchy. Well, that's why, because you can't seal them. So the question gets asked all the time, well, why do masks get used by surgeons, etc.? Well, the masks were always intended to stop the big guys, the droplets, not the aerosols or little guys. And they've been worn, this is another study that I cite, they've been worn basically to stop staff and patients from getting blood bodily fluids, droplets, big droplets splashed on them, both the patient as well as the surgeon. And they write, however, there's a lack of substantial evidence to support the claims that face masks protect either the patient or the surgeon from infectious contamination. In other words, the masks aren't to protect you from infectious diseases. They're to protect you from the big globs of droplets, blood, etc. And while I don't expect you to read all of this, you can go through and find study after study that shows that with respect to infectious disease transmission, there's no statistical difference between the infection rates of people wearing masks and not wearing masks. So masks do not work for non-droplet sized particles. That's the bottom line. Again, I always end my podcast with these 5 points. There's really the first 4 and then a recommendation as the 5th. Personal protective equipment is the least desirable way to protect people, and masks aren't PPE. Again, as I've said throughout these podcasts, the COVID particles are aerosols, primarily aerosols, not droplets. Remember, 99.9%. And so you would need a respirator if you're going to wear PPE to protect the lungs. And since these things are so small and dance around for days, up to days, the 6-foot rule really is meaningless for aerosols. And these smaller particles are the ones that get into the deep lung and cause a havoc. So what I've been advocating as an industrial hygienist over and over again is we should be using engineering controls, dilution, ventilation, and destruction. Again, appreciate you spending the time watching this podcast. If you have any questions about anything I've said, have other articles to support or not support it, I'd be glad to look at them. Feel free to write with your questions. Thanks for watching this. Have a great day.